It is Lever time for our weekly partnership segment with our friends over at The Lever. And joining us today is Matthew Cunningham Cook. Great to see you, sir.
Great to see you too, Krystal.
So you are focusing on something that we have been tracking very closely here, which is the Fed's decision to once again hike interest rates by 0.75 percentage points. Let's go ahead and put your piece up on the screen. You say the Fed chair's November surprise, Jerome Powell, is preparing to crash the economy days before the midterm elections, hurting workers and ushering his fellow Republicans into power. Break down for us what you argue here in this piece.
Yeah, basically, this decision we know is going to hurt working class Americans. We know that because of prior experiences of that. So in particular, starting in 1979, the Fed launched an aggressive interest rate strategy, and with the explicit goal of ending inflation. But it was very clear at the time that it was one type of inflation that the Fed was interested in. It was wage inflation. And so Paul Volcker famously kept an index card, a 3x5 index card that his staff would give him of the average construction worker wages, with the explicit goal of being like, well, if these wages are going down, then I'm doing my job. Wow. And then Powell has really echoed that. He has said he wants to get wages down. He has said that he needs to bring some pain to end inflation. And it's very clear that this is really just disguised class warfare. But I think what makes it kind of particularly concerning is that doing it a week before an election is really functionally indistinguishable from what James Comey did in 2016. It's an active intervention into the political process by an institution that claims to be above politics, that has the concrete effect of hurting one party's chances of winning. So that's the main thing here. And I think that it's something that we're so thankful to shows like Breaking Points for consistently covering this issue, because the mainstream media's reporting on this issue is really, really poor. My big hobby horse that I'm hoping to write about soon is the Fed does not include the fact that higher interest rates equal higher mortgage costs, higher refinancing costs into the way that it accounts for inflation. And 67% of Americans of households have a mortgage. So it's really a dangerous game that they're playing that has the concrete effect of throwing Americans out of work. And nobody's telling the truth about it except for a few smaller outlets.
Well, and there's an intentional effort to make Fed policy obscure, yes, make Americans think that they aren't smart enough or don't know enough to understand it or to critique it. This was really an effort, expressly undertaken by former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan, who, made his speeches intentionally opaque. So you had to have a PhD in economics to understand what the F he was saying. And this is all to give the appearance, and this is a very neoliberal thing that they do, that the experts are in charge. We're crunching the numbers. There's not even value judgments here. This is we're just doing the thing that the numbers tell us to do. When in fact, of course, there are value judgments here. And part of what, to me, in Jerome Powell's speech really gave away the game is he actually said, quote, "I don't think wages are the principal story for why prices are going up." And yet at other times he said, we need to get wages down. He said there needs to be some pain. So if you know that wages aren't the main problem for inflation, which of course they are, because the reality is wages are not keeping pace with inflation. So how could they be the main thing causing inflation? That doesn't make any sense. And yet you're continuing in this direction, knowing that your policy at the Fed is not actually having an impact on the things that are causing inflation. Well, then why are you continuing in the same direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that it's very, so, one of the things that, again, it's such a complex kind of issue when you get into the details. On the surface level, it's very simple. The Fed is declaring class warfare against working class Americans. But when you get into the details, it becomes a little bit more complicated, I would say. But one of the things that I that, again, we're hoping to report in the future that I think is really interesting is one of Jay Powell's former colleagues at the Carlyle Group has said that unlike basically every other industry in America, higher interest rates is going to be great for private equity. Why is that? Because the more distressed businesses that there are because of higher interest rates, the easier it is for Carlyle and other major private equity firms with huge amounts of dry powder capital at their disposal to purchase distressed companies on the cheap. So that's exactly what they're looking to do, in the same way, as you pointed out, that this, massive money hose from the Fed that emerged at the beginning of COVID also allowed private equity firms to purchase distressed businesses. So it's really, a heads I win, tails you lose, type situation here, where only the most powerful firms in the country are able to exploit this economic misery towards their benefits, and they just happen to be the former colleagues of the chairman of the Federal Reserve. The one thing that I think wasn't, that we addressed in the piece, but it wasn't in the top paragraph, which, and so that, that I will just point out is that, Biden reappointed Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, this year. A majority of Democratic senators voted to confirm him. And that was clearly a major mistake. That was clearly a major error on the Biden administration's part. And I think what it really underscores is just how terrified mainstream politicians are from taking on the Fed. When Trump attacked Powell for raising interest rates in 2018, there was all this, hand-wringing and pearl-clutching from the mainstream business press about Trump asking to keep interest rates low. And again, what that underscores is that the media is not going to tell the story that there is no constituency for higher interest rates. Even people worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the largest home builders in America, the largest construction firms in America, are all hurt by higher interest rates. The only constituency are the people with enough kind of actual capital at their disposal to buy low and then later sell high. And that's 0.01% of the population, 0.001% of the population. But again, they're including, it's so interesting, the business interests of members of Congress, True. That's their lawyers, they're medium-sized business owners type things. They're going to be hurt by this too. And really the sad fact is that there's very few members of Congress who understand what the Fed is actually doing and how it will impact the economy. And, it really ties back to kind of this, this organized demonization of Bernie Sanders in the 2016 and 2020 presidential campaign, where, every single one of his ideas were presented as extreme left or on the one side, or, racist or sexist on the other side. And it's really that was ultimately about obfuscating a real understanding of how the economy works. Mm-hmm. Bernie wrote an incredible op-ed in 2016 for the New York Times that talked about a broad set of reforms to the Fed to make it more accountable. The regional Fed boards all have banking and industry representation. Very few have any type of labor representation. None have any type of working class representation. Bernie was talking about addressing this. Instead of talking about those real issues, it was like, oh, well, Bernie is a nutcase on the one hand, or, Bernie is, a racist or a sexist on the other hand. And we're still living with the consequences of this organized demonization campaign against Bernie.
That's a great point. And I'd actually forgotten about that op-ed, so I'm glad you raised it again. I mean, we have this, look, I understand the importance of an independent Fed. I get that theoretically, but we play this game like the Fed is actually independent when it's not. I mean, Ken Klippenstein over at The Intercept just had a fantastic fantastic piece about all the meetings they're taking with banking interests and all the off-the-record meetings they're having with banking interests. So they're being lobbied by financial interests. They're allowed to have a say, apparently. They're not all, oh, hands off, it's independent. But when it comes to any sort of public input, that's where, the Fed is independent and we can't hear whatsoever from the population about how these things are impacting them. On the political piece, unfortunately, I think that the Biden administration and most mainstream Democrats have basically bought into the Republican theory of inflation. That's why they're, reluctant to put forward any economic agenda, positive economic agenda, if they're able to hold on to power, which as a consequence of not doing that, they are much less likely to hold on to power. That's number one. And number two, there's no indication that Biden really has any issue with what Jerome Powell is doing here, because outside of Elizabeth Warren and maybe a handful of others, I really don't hear many Democrats raising a lot of concerns about the direction of Fed policy.
Yeah, we've just started to see a trickle of interest. The one person, again, I think it's the smarter people in the Democratic Party who understand this. So John Hickenlooper, who's basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the oil and gas industry, recognizes that higher interest rates is going to really hurt the oil and gas industry. Some people would say that's a good thing. I would say, well, it's better to hurt the oil and gas industry by stopping drilling on federal lands or, by, passing oil and gas extraction taxes, as opposed to an ancillary effect of crushing the economy for ordinary workers. But yeah, you have a small group of Democratic senators finally starting to peep up, in a really important development. The AFL-CIO finally spoke up yesterday to speak out against these Fed rate hikes. But it's very much too little too late in so many cases, because this is really the type of stuff that should have been discussed, back in May. When we at the Lever, started talking about this. The moment that Powell started raising interest rates, we were covering it as an assault on workers. And we were pointing out that Powell was going after regular workers' wages. The Fed, which has incredible amounts of regulatory and supervisory authority over banks, was doing nothing to talk about the inflationary effects of banker bonuses, and particularly banker bonuses at banks with a long history or legacy of misconduct, like Credit Suisse or Wells Fargo. There was nothing, from the Fed on that front. And there is nothing on that front. And that's very deliberate. Powell is totally uninterested in going after his buddies on Wall Street. He's interested in going after working class Americans.
Well, these workers were getting a little bold, starting to organize, starting to agitate in all sorts of different ways. So had to get in there and discipline labor ultimately. So I think your framing of class warfare is the clearest one. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for the great reporting on this.
Thanks so much, Krystal. I appreciate your time.
Our pleasure. And thank you guys for watching. We will have more for you later. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.